The shovels bite into Maryland's soil with a hollow scrape. April 1829. Workers clearing land near Reliance stumble upon something that shouldn't be there. Fragments of bone, tattered cloth, the unmistakable curve of a human skull. Word spreads like wildfire through the eastern shore. By sunset, a crowd has gathered, their faces pale in the dying light as more graves reveal themselves. Children press against their mothers' skirts as whispered names float through the air. Names of the vanished. Sarah, who disappeared walking to market 3 winters past. Samuel, the free black carpenter whose tools were found abandoned by the roadside. A family of 5 who simply weren't there one morning, their cabin door swinging open to an empty hearth. The sheriff counts 11 bodies, 11 confirmed. Local women cross themselves and hurry their children indoors as darkness falls. But the questions multiply like shadows. How many more lie buried? How long has this been happening? And who could orchestrate such calculated horror in a place where everyone knows everyone? The property belongs to Patty Cannon, a woman whose very name makes grown men lower their voices. Some call her a businesswoman. Others whispered darker truths. Kidnapper, killer, the iron-willed matriarch of a gang that's turned human suffering into profit. Tonight, as lanterns flicker over the disturbed earth, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear. The soil of the eastern shore had been hiding more than crops. It had been feeding on secrets. 30 miles south, 30 years earlier. A young woman with steel-gray eyes stares back from faded memories, though even her name seems to shift like smoke. Lucretia Patricia Handley, some say, born in Maryland's marshy lowlands where the law moves as slowly as the tide. She's barely 20, but there's something unsettling in how she watches people, calculating, measuring their worth like livestock at auction. Neighbors remember her differently. Some recall a charming innkeeper's daughter with a quick wit. Others remember cold silences that stretched too long, a young woman who could smile while her eyes remained empty. The tavern where she works becomes her classroom. She studies the travelers who pass through, merchants flush with coin, slave catchers with their bounty maps, desperate families fleeing north. She learns which stories to believe, which tears are real, and most importantly, how much hope people will pay for. Her early life reads like pages torn from different books. Some say she was orphaned young, others that she ran from an arranged marriage. The truth dissolves in contradictory whispers, leaving only the shape of someone who learned early that survival meant reinvention. What everyone agrees on is this: Patty Cannon emerged fully formed from those marshy borderlands where Maryland bleeds into Delaware, where jurisdiction gets muddy and questions go unanswered. She understood something most people never grasp, that in the spaces between official maps, between state lines and moral certainties, terrible opportunities take root. The woman who would become the queen of kidnappers was already studying her kingdom. By 1810, Patty has claimed her throne, a tavern at Johnson's Crossroads where 3 states converge in a maze of jurisdiction and willful blindness. She's no longer the calculating young woman from the marsh. She's transformed into something harder, more dangerous. Marriage to Jesse Cannon gives her respectability, but it's her partnership with Joe Johnson that gives her power. Johnson is everything she needs, a black man whose mixed-race heritage allows him to move freely between worlds, speaking the language of both the enslaved and their captors. Together, they realize something chilling. The chaos of America's early 19th century, with its patchwork of slave laws and racial classifications, isn't an obstacle, it's an opportunity. Their tavern becomes a spider's web. Travelers seek shelter, but Patty studies them with predatory patience. Free black families heading north represent more than hope. They represent profit. A healthy man might fetch $400 at a Charleston market. A woman with children, even more. The transformation is methodical. What begins as opportunistic theft, a lost traveler who disappears in the night, evolves into systematic hunting. They develop codes, safe houses, a network of accomplices who ask no questions as long as the money flows. Patty's maternal facade masks something monstrous. She's learned to see people as inventory. The local community chooses blindness over confrontation. After all, Patty Cannon provides services, information, shelter, connections. Her tavern thrives while around it people vanish like morning mist. Those who suspect stay silent, because challenging Patty Cannon means challenging something bigger than one woman. They're challenging an empire built on stolen lives, and everyone profits from looking the other way. The killing starts with necessity, not pleasure. Spring of 1821. A young black woman named Charity escapes their custody, running toward freedom with knowledge that could destroy everything. Joe Johnson tracks her through the Pine Barrens, but when cornered, Charity fights like a wildcat. The struggle ends with a rock to Charity's skull. As she lies bleeding in the dirt, Patty makes a calculation that will define her legacy. Killing is just another business decision. Charity knows too much. Charity has seen too much. Charity becomes the first confirmed casualty in Patty's war against witnesses. The murder changes something fundamental. What had been containment becomes elimination. A captured family from Pennsylvania poses too many questions. Their disappearance has attracted attention from Northern abolitionists. 3 shallow graves solve that problem. When a young boy starts crying for his parents, Patty's response is swift and merciless. The pattern emerges with terrifying clarity. Victims are lured with promises of help, safe passage north, work opportunities, reunions with lost family. Instead, they find themselves chained in Patty's cellar, waiting for transport to southern markets. Those who resist, those who remember too much, those who might testify, simply disappear. Local folklore begins to shift. Children are warned away from Johnson's Crossroads after dark. Travelers choose longer routes to avoid Patty's Tavern. But official records remain clean. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence beyond whispered rumors that evaporate in daylight. The murders aren't random violence, they're calculated business strategies. Each death eliminates risk, preserves secrecy, and sends a message to anyone considering resistance. Fear becomes Patty Cannon's most effective weapon, and she wields it with surgical precision. By 1825, the Cannon-Johnson operation has evolved into something unprecedented, a criminal enterprise spanning 3 states with the efficiency of a legitimate business. Their network stretches from Philadelphia to Savannah, with safe houses, corrupt officials, and market connections that would impress any merchant prince. The scale is breathtaking. Kidnapping raids target not just individuals, but entire communities. Free black settlements wake to find families vanished overnight, leaving only scattered belongings and terrified survivors. Children disappear from their beds. Adults vanish from their fields. The gang operates with military precision, using coded messages and predetermined routes that zigzag across state boundaries to confuse any pursuit. Patty's Tavern serves as mission control. Maps cover the walls, marked with potential targets and safe routes. She maintains detailed records. Which markets pay highest prices? Which officials can be bought? Which communities have grown too suspicious? It's bookkeeping for human misery, and she approaches it with chilling professionalism. The operation's success breeds overconfidence. Gang members grow careless, flashing money in taverns, bragging about their exploits. Some start freelancing, grabbing victims without approval and creating unnecessary heat. Patty tries to maintain discipline through fear and violence, but the organization has grown too large to control perfectly. Most disturbing is how normalized the horror becomes. Local communities develop unspoken agreements. See nothing, know nothing, profit when possible. Legitimate businesses provide supplies. Respected citizens invest in trading ventures without asking what's being traded. The entire Eastern Shore becomes complicit in an enterprise that treats human beings as livestock, and Patty Cannon reigns over it all like a queen counting her terrible treasure. The unraveling begins with a single thread, a teenage boy named Peter who should have been just another statistic. Kidnapped from a Philadelphia street in December 1828, Peter endures the nightmare journey south, chained in wagon beds and hidden in cellars. But unlike other victims, Peter memorizes everything: faces, names, routes, the layout of Patty's stronghold. When the gang stops at a tavern near Dover, Peter makes a desperate gamble. As guards drink themselves stupid, he slips his bonds and runs. 3 days later, bleeding and half dead from cold, he stumbles into a Quaker household whose members believe his incredible story. The Quakers don't just offer sympathy, they offer action. Within weeks, Peter's testimony reaches authorities who can't ignore such detailed accusations. Names, dates, locations, everything that transforms rumor into evidence. For the first time, someone has survived long enough to provide a roadmap to Patty's empire. The timing couldn't be worse for Patty. Anti-slavery sentiment is growing, and newspapers hungry for scandal seize on Peter's story. "The Kidnapping Queen of the Eastern Shore," reads one headline. Suddenly, what had been whispered speculation becomes front-page horror. State authorities, embarrassed by publicity and pressure from Pennsylvania officials, finally act. Search warrants are issued. Witnesses who had stayed silent for years suddenly find their voices. The wall of complicity that protected Patty begins cracking under the weight of public outrage. Peter's escape does more than save his own life. It lights a fuse that will explode Patty Cannon's carefully constructed world. One boy's courage becomes the catalyst that brings down an empire. The newspapers feast on horror like vultures on carrion. "Female fiend of the Eastern Shore," screams the Philadelphia Inquirer. The Baltimore Patriot describes Patty as a monster in woman's form. But there's something else in their coverage, a sick fascination, a voyeuristic thrill that sells papers faster than political news. Patty becomes America's first female serial killer celebrity, though the term won't exist for another century. Editorial writers simultaneously condemn her crimes and marvel at her audacity. How could a woman, a mother even, orchestrate such calculated evil? The coverage reveals as much about 1829 America's anxieties about gender and power as it does about Patty's crimes. Law enforcement scrambles to catch up with public outrage. Delaware's Attorney General, who had turned blind eyes to Patty's operation for years, suddenly discovers urgent interest in justice. Maryland officials, embarrassed by their inaction, flood the peninsula with investigators who should have been there long ago. The investigation reveals the scope of official corruption. Local magistrates had taken bribes. Sheriff's deputies had provided information about enforcement plans. Even some judges had financial interests in keeping the kidnapping trade flowing. The entire system had been compromised, making Patty's operation possible. Evidence emerges from a dozen sources. Survivors identify locations. Former accomplices, sensing the changing winds, offer testimony in exchange for immunity. Financial records surface showing impossible profits from legitimate trading ventures. Each revelation spawns new headlines, new public demands for accountability. But perhaps the most chilling discovery is how many people knew and stayed silent. An entire region had become complicit in systematic horror, choosing profit and convenience over human decency. April 30th, 1829. Dawn breaks gray and cold as Delaware authorities surround Johnson's Crossroads Tavern. There's no dramatic chase, no final shootout, just the dull click of iron shackles closing around Patty Cannon's wrists as she's led from her empire in chains. She's 57 years old, gray-haired and thick-waisted, looking more like somebody's grandmother than America's most wanted criminal. But her eyes remain sharp, calculating, even in defeat. As officers search her property, she watches with the detached interest of someone reviewing inventory. The interrogation reveals something perhaps more disturbing than rage or madness: complete indifference. When confronted with evidence of murders, Patty responds with shrugs and cold practicality. People die, she tells investigators. Sometimes they need help dying. According to newspaper reports, she confesses to killing more than I can remember, though this may be journalistic embellishment. What seems certain is her complete lack of remorse. She discusses murder with the same tone she might use for discussing livestock prices. Necessary business decisions, nothing more. The most chilling moment comes when asked about the children. A prosecutor demands to know how she could kill innocents. Patty's response, recorded by multiple witnesses, becomes the stuff of nightmares. Dead children don't grow up to testify. Her arrest reveals the careful record she kept. Ledgers detailing transactions, maps marking safe routes, even crude sketches of victims for identification purposes. It's the bureaucracy of horror, filed away with the same care a shopkeeper might use for inventory. She shows no emotion except mild annoyance at the inconvenience, as if murder and kidnapping were simply misunderstood entrepreneurial ventures. The trial never happens. On May 11, 1829, just 11 days after her arrest, Patty Cannon cheats the hangman in the most final way possible. Her cellmate finds her at dawn, blue-faced and still, an empty vial of arsenic nearby. The suicide deprives justice of its moment, but provides its own grim satisfaction. In her final act, Patty maintains control, choosing her own end rather than submitting to the state's judgment. Even in death, she refuses to play by anyone else's rules. The aftermath reveals the true scope of her crimes. Property searches uncover more bodies, more evidence of systematic murder. Conservative estimates put her victim count at 11 confirmed murders, with dozens more disappearances directly linked to her organization. Some investigators suggest the true number may never be known. Her gang scatters to the winds. Joe Johnson disappears entirely, possibly fleeing to the Caribbean or South America. Minor accomplices face their own trials, though most receive surprisingly light sentences in exchange for testimony against their dead leader. The corruption that enabled her operation quietly dissolves into bureaucratic amnesia. But justice remains incomplete. The families whose loved ones vanished will never know their fates. The communities terrorized by her gang struggle to rebuild trust. The officials who took her bribes face no consequences, their complicity forgotten in the rush to close this ugly chapter. Most disturbing of all, the systems that enabled her crimes, the intersection of slavery, weak law enforcement, and economic desperation, remain unchanged. Patty Cannon is gone, but the conditions that created her empire survive. Her death ends one horror story, but leaves the larger questions unanswered. The Earth still holds its secrets near Reliance, Maryland. Developers and farmers occasionally unearth fragments, a button here, bone chips there, reminders that some horrors refuse to stay buried. Local historians estimate Patty Cannon's confirmed victims in the dozens, but the true count remains hidden beneath decades of soil and silence. She represents something uniquely American and uniquely terrifying, the intersection of capitalism and cruelty, where human suffering becomes just another commodity. In the borderlands, where slavery met freedom, where state authority grew thin and moral certainty blurred, she found opportunity in chaos. Her story forces uncomfortable questions about complicity and silence. How many neighbors suspected but said nothing? How many officials looked the other way for profit? How many communities chose willful blindness over difficult truths? Patty Cannon didn't operate in isolation. She thrived because an entire region enabled her crimes. Perhaps most chilling is how ordinary she appeared. Not a wild-eyed maniac or obvious monster, but a middle-aged innkeeper who understood that systematic evil requires systematic indifference. Her greatest weapon wasn't violence, it was the human tendency to look away from unthinkable truths. The Delmarva Peninsula has moved on, built subdivisions over graveyards, paved roads across her old hunting grounds. But history has a way of surfacing when least expected. Construction crews still find things they don't expect. Archaeologists still map locations of her safe houses. The earth remembers what people wish to forget, and it never lets go.